New today, longtime Trump friend and advisor Roger Stone talking to NBC News outside of his home in Florida one day after the special counsel charged him. And here's what he said just a short time ago.
This was an egregious overreach by Mr. Mueller. The FBI director who had to have approved this raid should, in my opinion, be fired over it because it was unwarranted. I guess it's an effort to intimidate me, but I am not intimidated. I am concerned for my wife, and one of my dogs is still traumatized, will not come out from under the bed, and won't stop shaking. The allegation that two campaign officials instructed me or inquired of me about WikiLeaks is false.
All right, Stone denying one of the most consequential allegations from his indictment. Prosecutors writing that, quote, a senior Trump campaign official was directed to contact Stone about any additional releases and other damaging information WikiLeaks had regarding the Clinton campaign. So the question now, capturing the political and legal world, did then candidate Donald Trump give that directive? Stone denies Trump was involved in talks about WikiLeaks, and the president denies any collusion. Roger Stone is set to appear in court on Tuesday. He was charged with 7 counts of lying to Congress, obstruction, and witness tampering. He was not charged, though, with conspiring against the United States. But his indictment reveals a clearer picture of potential ties between the Trump campaign and WikiLeaks. Joining me now is former Trump campaign advisor Sam Nunberg. Sam, great to have you with me right here. This is the first time you actually heard those words from Roger Stone as he stepped out of his home just a moment ago. What are your thoughts on that, calling this an egregious overreach by Mr. Mueller and saying that even his dogs are so traumatized they won't come out?
Well, it seemed to me that it was pretty aggressive that they raided Roger's house like that. From what I understand, it was 39 FBI agents, and that they came there early in the morning, which fine is routine. But knowing Roger was expecting to be indicted, I am sure that he would have gone to, he was not going to flee the country, as the Justice Department said, Francis, nor was he going to destroy anything after he already knew he was going to be indicted. But that's up to the FBI. I mean, that's one of the issues, though, that people have complained about with this investigation, about how some of these people have been treated.
But does that surprise you in how he's coming out now and speaking and taking the tone that he has in the message that he's giving out there? He was your mentor.
Yes.
You had predicted that this was going to be coming.
Right.
Time and time again here. So based on your knowledge about that and the Trump campaign, what does it tell you now that this is how he's coming out of it, and especially with these indictments?
Well, Roger here is now saying, look, Roger is going to not plead guilty. He's already said this, and I am sure Roger will want to take this case to trial, just in the very instance, because of Roger's personality, that he will make the government have to prove their case. This will be something that people have not seen before. If you wanted, it'll be an O.J. Simpson type case for politics. What I would say is very, very critical. What Roger has just said, if you read the indictment, Francis, there's the part where Roger had contact with Steve Bannon. The part we're all talking about is the unnamed Trump advisors in July when Manafort, Gates are there, and who directed them. If he is saying none of that is true, then the government has to prove that. And that would go also to saying that Roger did not have the intent to lie to Congress, because he was not really covering anything up in terms of not talking about Corsi.
Especially when we're talking about that word, directed, and this top line here.
Very interesting.
You know, very interesting about that. It's interesting, I know you talked about it before, because the question now is, what will it take? Will he get pushed so far to flip? And he said, even just in the past 24 hours, he's not going to bend, he's not going to fold, he's not going to do it. He was just going to fight this. And you said you could see him taking those years in jail. You could see him doing that, because what'll happen after, I think you had mentioned earlier, Roger, he would love the limelight afterwards.
Yeah, Roger is someone who, he even said yesterday, it's better to be infamous than
not famous.
I would also say it was very interesting, though, Francis, because we're talking about the shutdown, too. Remember, President Trump signs to open up the government, and then Speaker Pelosi starts tweeting about Roger Stone yesterday. This case has large implications, and that indictment, what he said in those paragraphs, have large implications to the conspiracy charge that the president will be facing in Congress. And Roger, for his part, as opposed to me, who I no longer have, has an affinity and a bond with the president that he will stand by him. He respects him, and he's a friend of his.
Yeah, I want to talk to you about the involvement here, because that's the question here. Where in all of this does the president fall, right? So we have this portion here in the indictment that says, quote, senior Trump campaign officials reached out to Stone to ask about information WikiLeaks was expected to release on Hillary Clinton. I want to play what Stone told Fox News about who those officials may have been, and we'll talk about it.
The Trump campaign official who directed Stone to find out about WikiLeaks was Donald Trump. No, it was not. There are several things in here in the indictment that are simply not true.
So who was it if it wasn't the president? Who is?
Well, I have to speculate about that, because since it never happened, it appears to me that they have composed testimony for someone. Perhaps Rick Gates, perhaps Steve Bannon.
All right, so you just mentioned this. You were talking about that, but how far in there is the involvement? Could it be Donald Trump?
Well, look, the short answer is we don't know.
Yeah.
Mueller is very, very careful about how he drafts these indictments. That was put in there for a reason. I suspect that was put in there for a reason for Mueller's purpose because of coming indictments. That's a presumption. I have no obviously direct knowledge of it. But in terms of Roger, that is a critical point. And if Roger says that this conversation did not happen, we'll see Roger's defense, Francis, then it would make sense that Roger did not lie to Congress because Roger just did not recall possibly the Corsi issue. What I think the indictment made the point of is that Roger, they're arguing, the Mueller special counsel is going to argue that because he was directed by the Trump campaign, he didn't want to disclose that he was having conversations with Corsi.
All right, I want to expand on something that you told my colleague, Aaron Melber, when you were on with him as far as Roger Stone colluding with Russia. Let's remind our viewers if they didn't see it.
Was he trying to collude? I think he was. I don't think he did. As I said, I think he conspired against himself. Would he have? Would he have gone? Look, I can't speak for him, but maybe he would have. That's exactly right. So what I'm saying is, would he have met with Assange? If Assange is, I believe Assange is, okay, I'm not arguing he isn't. Would he have met with Assange, looked at WikiLeaks? Would he have strategized with Assange? Yes, he would have, but he didn't. He was desperate. And what he did was, I think, unfortunately for him, is one, obviously made himself a public target. Everybody has been talking about these tweets that he has done, the Podesta tweets, the tweets coming in October of 2016. You can see his explanation for it. But number two, what we do see from the indictment, Francis, is that he was trying to, but he didn't. I can't tell you if he did. I would think if he had I could see Roger having a camera and visiting with Julian Assange during the summer of 2016 because that is Roger's mystique. That is the idea of being relevant, being part of the ruckus of the election. But he didn't.
Talk a little bit more about that. It's fascinating because, again, as a guy who you work so closely with and know in the level that you do, and here he is coming out and knowing, you know, like we said, he self-proclaimed dirty trickster. Is this guy, you know, he has his tattoo in the back. Yesterday he comes out and he does the Nixon wave on here. So what are we going to see?
And I'm sure that picture will be framed in his house like 3 months from now, 2 months from now.
So there you go. So is this the Roger Stone that we're going to be seeing time and time again, whether or not there is going to be a collusion charge down the road, or if we see this, you know, go to trial and he sticks with it? Here's what
I think, having, once again, because of being in that voluntary in the grand jury, being in the Senate Intel, I think that they have given a complete forensic to Roger Stone. If they thought that if they had evidence that Roger colluded directly with the Russians or met with Julian Assange directly, they would have released it, or they would have waited further down the line in terms of the narrative that Mueller is building with these indictments. So what I do think, though, is once again, assuming Roger has the means, he will defend himself, and this will be a spectacle of a trial, and that will go to a jury.
When you say means, doesn't he have the means?
I certainly, well, I don't know his bank account, but I think he will have the means from public support through his legal defense fund. Yes, I think he will, because, look, he's already been attacked. Once again, Nancy Pelosi has called out the president based on this indictment. Roger now is going to be a critical piece towards saving the Trump presidency.
It's interesting he came out in this video again just moments ago within the past hour. And again, I think it's fascinating that you're seeing and hearing it for the first time because he's saying he's not intimidated. He goes back in. You know, there's a little chuckle, there's a little smile here. And he goes on to say that he's not intimidated What's he doing behind his closed doors now, today and in the days to come?
If I had to guess, he's strategizing. He's studying the indictment, having other lawyers, other professionals that would be within the attorney-client privilege.
Strategizing for what outcome? For what is his?
I do not believe there is a chance that Roger would, in any case, cooperate with the government, especially because Roger has already publicly stated numerous times that he did not discuss WikiLeaks with the president. So therefore, I don't know how he could then, offer anything to them. What I think is that Roger will put on a case to a jury. And he will fight this, and he will look for a fair trial.
Do you think that there's any part of this that he realizes that jail cell, jail time, prison would be part of his reality in 20 plus? I believe is the sentence. The penalty.
I think 20 plus would be, actually, if they did that to him, I think that would be ridiculous. Okay, so
really,
well, for the amount of time, for what he's being charged with, how they would if they do it concurrently, if they do it consecutively, I think that they should really have a little the Justice Department and Mueller should have a little. They should have a little Rachmanis, or I don't know what the proper word is. Be a little, But what I would say is that I think he's willing to face the consequences. But I mean, this whole idea I've been hearing that he can get 20 years, 10 years, 15. I think normally people say there's like a 4-year, 2 or 3 years. He knows. I think he's accepted the fact he's going to be indicted, as he said publicly in August. Yeah. Right, last year. So I think probably even earlier than that. You could not have called in as many people of his in his sphere as they did, and not even ask him a single question. And his lawyers publicly said that they had reached out to the special counsel's office and never been contacted back. I hope he does get better lawyers, though, I would say. Interesting.
And you also mentioned on MSNBC earlier that if he does do time, you can see him coming out, giving speeches and doing the whole Roger Stone thing.
Sure. I mean, look at Jay Gordon Liddy. Look at a lot of these Nixon people that stayed part of Republican politics after they came out. They had nationally syndicated radio shows, and they were around the arena, as Nixon used to call it, in the arena. So I personally hope that doesn't happen, to be honest with you.
Tell me why. Why is that the case, that you don't think that happens?
I said I hope it doesn't. I can't tell you what's going to happen in the case. Okay. I think Roger is a victim of him. We were mistreated by Trump in the beginning of this campaign. I was fired. Roger quit. We were not treated well the minute somebody else was brought in. Trump is not a loyal person, but Roger's very loyal to Trump.
So you think he was victimized?
I don't want to say he was. I think that he. It's tough to say he's victim. Well, I think that he put himself in a position that he wanted to ingratiate himself and continue to get Donald Trump, help Donald Trump. But let me just tell you something. I mean, Donald Trump didn't. Those people there didn't want anything to do with him, even if Trump was talking to him, and I found that very disrespectful myself.
Sandberg, thank you so much for the extra time that you spent with us. I appreciate all that and your insights, too. Thank you.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.